So today I'm going to talk about mixing and creativity. Now, normally we think of creativity as being something that's only part of the production process or the composition process, not so much part of the back end of mixing and mastering. However, I think everybody would agree that there's sort of a thin dividing line between production and mixing. You can say very clearly, okay, mixing is this thing and production is this thing. But in practicality, there's often an interaction and sort of movements in between, and it becomes a little bit blurred. When I think of the most creative records that I've listened to, and I don't mean the most creative songs necessarily, but the most creative recordings, there is certainly a lot of creativity happening in the mixing side of it. Things like Nine Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral, even The Fragile to an extent, Steven Wilson's Insurgents, and particularly if you go back even to sort of the early 70s stuff, Pink Floyd and that sort of thing, it's not like mixing was separate from the whole process of creativity. There's definitely a massive amount of creativity happening in the mixing itself. Part of that comes back to what I talked about in the first video on this channel about, mixing philosophy, why we mix. Mixing should ideally be used to support a mood. And when it's used right, you can use it in really creative ways, inspiring ways. So I think, you can't just take something and send it off to somebody. They might make it sound great, but they may not mix it in a creative way necessarily. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with just making something sound aesthetically better. But I think particularly nowadays, where almost everybody is doing their own mixing and mastering and whatnot, there's a lot more scope for people to get into the creative side of mixing. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you think of electronic music, mixing has always been a big part of the creativity there, whether it's, taking a low-pass, high-pass filter and running it up the length of the spectrum, then back down again to create a particular sound or to create a particular drop when it's bringing it down. Or if you're using ducking to really bring the kick up really fully, make the other instruments drop away so that kick is really boom, boom, boom in your face. It's not like it's not like mixing is separate to creating the mood, right? It's something that's an integral part of it. When I think about my own work, I think of a couple of instances where the mixing actually became part of the production in a way. In one place, I took a basic tapping sound that I did just on a table, tap, 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 tap. And then I took a flanger and I ran the flanger up to some really extreme out-of-place settings. And then I altered the parameters of the flanger on the fly, and what I ended up with was you couldn't hear the tap anymore. It was just something that sounded kind of like a weird sitar, like that. So I would really encourage people to play around with plugins, play around with effects on your instruments, and really see what you can do in terms of creating different sounds out of what you've got. For my More Dimensions soundtrack, which I did for a Quake mod, you can look it up under xolve.bandcamp.com, that's XOLVE. I did a lot of stuff with taking sounds, slowing them down by maybe 16 times, and then running a whole bunch of effects on them to get stuff that sounded nothing like the original sound, right? And you could say that's production, but in this sense, it's very blurred. When you're taking something that's an outside recording, you have no idea what you're going to use it for, and you slow it down, and you find sounds in there that are very extreme, very different from what you recorded, and then you take effects and you run that over it, and by the end of it, for example, in some places I had something that sounded like sort of breathy, open, airy synth that had just come from me recording a skill saw, right? So I really encourage people to get creative on the mixing side of it and just to see where their ears lead them, There's lots of different plugins that you can use to aid you on this side of things. A few I like would be iZotope Nectar. I've used that on a lot of non-vocal sources just because it's got a lot of interesting effects in it. But I mean, there's just so much out there, right? There's so much freeware plugins, there's so many paid plugins. You can really go to town. And sometimes, even when you've got a really fixed idea for a song and how it's going to be, you might, as a mix engineer, get it to a particular moment and just hear something and go, oh, that would be very interesting at this point if that just completely dropped out and we just came away to just this track here and maybe put a band pass on it so it sort of sounds like it's being put through a megaphone or something like that. You know, there are things that can be done in the mixing side of things to really get things to that next level of creativity. So don't think that the creative process ends necessarily once you've got your recording and your composing and your production done. Mixing is also a creative art. I would argue that it's probably the most technical out of the different skill sets that go into making music, but it is still has a very strong component of creativity. And if you are a composer, if you are a creative person, it's worthwhile exploring those possibilities in that space once you get to that point in the process. Anyway,